Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation in memory of Richard Heffner, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Angelson Family Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, the Joan Gantz CUNY and Peter G. Peterson Fund, Carnegie Corporation of New York, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. I'm Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. In the history of this program, perhaps no past guests' insights were as profoundly rooted in our contemporary American experience than the patriot who joins us today. Before the late media critic Neil Postman sounded the alarm that Americans were amusing themselves to death, our guest presciently forecast a vast wasteland of television that threatened to degrade our culture, if not outright destroy the common good. He is Newton Minow, Chairman Emeritus of PBS, whom in 1961 President John F. Kennedy appointed Chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. The Walter Annenberg Professor Emeritus at Northwestern University, Minow is Senior Counsel at Sidley Austin, where he was partner for 3 decades. In that prophetic speech, his inaugural public address before the National Association of Broadcasters, Minow warned of a noxious megaphone of game show violence, murder, Western bad men, gangsters, more violence, and cartoons. As he reflected on the 50th anniversary of his landmark speech in the Atlantic Monthly, Minow identified the words he wanted to endure: public interest. He wrote, "To me that meant, as it still means, that we should constantly ask, what can communications do for our country, for the common good, for the American people?" To the distinguished Chairman Emeritus, the question today is, how can we chart a path to a vast common good as opposed to a vast wasteland? And it is such an honor to have you here today.
Alexander, it's a great honor for me. I was a friend of your grandfather, who started The Open Mind and who was the first executive director or manager of Channel 13 New York, which I'm very proud of because we started Channel 13 when I was in the government.
And you said that Channel 13 really marked the beginning of public broadcasting. Without Channel 13, public media today would not be possible.
When President Kennedy and I went into the government in 1961, we discovered something neither of us knew, that although he came from Boston and I came from Chicago, where there were what they called then educational television stations, there was none in New York, there was none in Washington, there was none in Los Angeles, there was none in most parts of the United States. And I knew that without having a station in New York, it would be impossible to have a national service. So we changed a commercial station, Channel 13, and converted it into a non-for-profit public station, and that's the history, and that became really a foundation, that the Washington station, the Los Angeles station, Chicago, became the foundation of a national service.
News programming on commercial stations does have merit at times, but as you indicate, it's much more difficult today for the civic-oriented programming to seep into our culture. How do we get back to that? I mean, if you were chairman of the FCC today, what would you be doing?
Well, I don't think the commercial stations are by any means evil. I have been a member of the board of CBS for years, a member of the board of the Tribune stations, so I don't regard them as evil. The problem is that their finance depends on selling advertising. And as a result, they want to reach, they have to reach, the largest audience they can all the time. And as a result, most programming does not reflect what the entire country wants.
And it doesn't necessarily reflect the social imperative of information that's going to breed a culture of citizenship.
You and I are conducting this program just when the Roosevelt series ended its first broadcast on PBS. The Roosevelt series was magnificent. You could learn American history in a new way over 100 years of American history. Why was a program like that not on commercial television? And why won't it be on commercial television? 14 hours, a enormous effort with historians, and I think that's because of the need to get advertisers and the need to raise money. It's important that we have a service, a broadcast service, which is not dependent on commercial interests.
And that is really the uniqueness of public television, public broadcasting.
Well, you mentioned Sesame Street. I can tell you a little story about that. I was on the predecessor of PBS. It was called NET. And at a meeting in New York, a young woman named Joan CUNY gave us the first presentation of what would be Sesame Street. I was knocked out by it. A brand new chairman of the FCC, who was a friend of mine, Dean Birch. Dean was a Republican from Arizona, was Senator Goldwater's campaign manager in 1964. And Dean had asked me for ideas as he took over the chairmanship of the FCC. And I went from New York to Washington to have a meeting with him. And I told him about Sesame Street. And I told him about Joan. And he said, "What'd she look like?" And I said, "She was very nice looking, sort of medium sized." And he said, "Did the name Gans come up?" I said, "Yes. As a matter of fact, she was introduced as Joan Gans CUNY." He said, "You won't believe this, Newt." He said, "I asked her to marry me when we went to the University of Arizona together. How do I reach her?" So I put them in touch together, and he invited her to Washington, and he said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" She said, "Well, I've got foundation funding, mostly from the Carnegie Corporation." But she said, "I asked the government, HEW, to help me bring it across the country. I've asked for $1 million, and HEW turned me down." And Dean said, "Well, I think I can help you with that." He said, "Senator Goldwater has HEW's budget. If you go with me, I'll take you over to see Senator Goldwater." She went in to see Senator Goldwater, and Goldwater said, Gans, "Are you from Arizona?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Are you related to Harry Gans?" And she said, "Harry's my uncle." And Goldwater got up, threw his arms around her, and he said, "Harry was my first contributor when I first ran for office. What can I do for you?" He proceeded to call HEW, got her the money, and Senator Goldwater is responsible for Big Bird.
With the threat of corporations now seeping into the internet on this issue of net neutrality, again, if you were chairman, or if you were advising the chairman, how would you try to manage this relationship with corporate America in a way that can preserve the educational value of public media?
Well, I've told President Obama, whom I knew long before he became president, that the FCC is, in my view, the one agency of the government that has more intimate contact every day with every citizen of this country. If you want to make a telephone call, if you want to watch television, if you want to listen to the radio, if you want to send an email message, whatever you want to do involving any form of communication, you're dealing with something that under our law, the FCC regulates. I think the FCC's burden today is much more complicated than it was when I was there. The internet had not been invented. The whole computer technology was just beginning. I think the government's obligation, and this is what I felt as my basic purpose, was to enlarge choice. So we opened up cable. We opened up pay TV, such as HBO or Showtime or whatever. We opened up UHF. We opened up satellite television. The government should enable as many people as possible to operate a communication service for the entire country. We certainly succeeded in that. The choice today is extraordinary. We did not succeed, however, in funding properly an essential non-commercial service. PBS, WNET, all the 200-odd public stations struggle each day, and we've got to do better on that if we want to preserve the values. On the internet, going back to your question, I think the FCC will see to it that the internet remains open to everybody on equal terms. And I'm sure that will happen.
You talk about the expansion of choice under your tenure as chairman and in successive tenures of the people who followed you. In that expansion of choice, though, was exactly what you honestly projected, which is if there's not a publicly focused, a public-minded moral compass guiding programmers, the result is going to be all the choices are bad.
Well, you got to go back to history to understand what happened. When broadcasting was invented through radio, most countries started with a publicly funded service. It was not a commercial service. Britain started with the BBC. The Japanese started with NHK. The Canadians, French, everybody all over started with a non-commercial service. We did the opposite. And when I went to the FCC, I found the man who wrote the Federal Communications Act. He was still alive. And I said, what was your thinking? And he said, well, we were just out of the Depression. We wanted people to invest in this, and we knew that we had to encourage investment.
As an opportunity for growth.
And that succeeded. But at the same time, we failed to do the other side of it, which was to offer a non-commercial service side by side.
And that really, I'm so glad you mentioned that history, because that's really the origin of this conundrum, wanting to achieve a democratic media culture, and then the imperative of making money. I mean, that's really the original historical puzzle.
Well, Congress tried to, as very often, Congress tried to find a compromise to achieve two sort of contradictory and reconcile two contradictory purposes. So they said a broadcaster had to serve the public interest, not the private interest, the public interest. And we've been arguing about what that means ever since the Communications Act was created in 1934.
What does it mean to you today?
Well, it means to me, I'll give you a specific example of what I think. Where we've really failed is in covering politics. We do not provide public service time to our political candidates. I'm a member of the Commission on Presidential Debates, been involved in every debate. That's the one time in our national elections when the candidates are provided time without having to pay for it. And what we've got now is enormous amounts of money going to candidates for one purpose. That's to buy time on radio and television, in which the kind of commercials that are too often run are degrading the opponent, are not talking about issues. And where we really have failed is dealing with use of this medium properly for political education and political campaigns.
Money is not speech.
I think the Supreme Court has gone crazy with this idea that money is speech. In fact, I wrote an article about this, and later Justice Stevens commented to me about it. Suppose you're arguing a case in the Supreme Court. You're a lawyer, you're arguing a case in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says you've got 30 minutes. And I said, well, I can't get it done in 30 minutes. I'll buy an additional 30 minutes. They said, well, are you crazy? You can't buy time. Well, you said money is speech. Here's a check. Here, give me another 30 minutes. The Supreme Court would say, you're nuts. We can limit the amount of time that you have here. Except, they say, there's no limit on the amount of time if you're the Koch brothers or somebody else. You can buy time on television. It's crazy. Money is not speech.
You wrote in your Atlantic piece, finally and critically, if over-the-air television is to survive as a licensed service operating in the public interest, we must make better use of it in our politics. And you elaborate on the point you just made. So I'm wondering, given that you sit on the commission that constructs the debate system that we have, how can the Commission on Presidential Debates lead a kind of revolution within our political discourse so that there is a regulated political conversation that occurs irrespective of how many dollars one candidate has or another candidate has?
I wish there was a commission at every level of the political process. The one I'm on deals only with the race for president. But I would think in local races and state races, there should be some form where a candidate, regardless of whether they have money or not, has a chance to present his or her views to the electorate.
I do have to bring my grandfather into this.
Well,
bless his heart. He believed very adamantly and imparted this to his students and taught the fairness doctrine. Something that has been criticized by conservatives and increasingly liberals too. And it was a very basic stipulation that if you give 30 minutes or 30 seconds to a candidate from one perspective, that you should get the counter perspective.
Certainly your grandfather was right. The idea of the fairness doctrine was much more important when we had so few channels. I mean, if you lived in a city where there was one television station and the owner of that station didn't want other viewpoints to be heard, the government had to step in and say, you got to have a fairness doctrine where other people get to speak. Now that you've got so many voices, it's a different story. But watching the Roosevelt series reminded me, when I was at the FCC, Mrs. Roosevelt called me one day, and she said, why aren't you helping Reverend Smith? And I said, I'm sorry, Mr. Roosevelt, I don't know. She said, Reverend Smith is a black minister in Jackson, Mississippi, and he's running for Congress, and he went to the WLBT, the local television, with a check. He didn't want anything for nothing. He wanted to buy something. They won't let him talk. Well, I got into it. It's a long story. We don't have time for it. But he got on the air. He lost the election. Later, there was a hearing in Congress, and it turned out Reverend Smith was running against the incumbent. His name was John Bell Williams. Congressman Williams started giving me a hard time and saying, why is the government telling a television station who they have to put on the air? And I said, wait a minute, Congressman. This was your race. It was your opponent. It was in Jackson, Mississippi, running against a black candidate who was a minister. He got up and walked out. Later, many years later, I met Aaron Gregory, who said to me, you know who I am? And I said, no. He said, well, you were chairman of the FCC. I was Reverend Smith's campaign manager. I'm the one that called Mrs. Roosevelt. I'm the one that wrote you that letter. I said, Mr. Gregory, what do you do now? He says, you don't know what I do now? I said, no, I don't, sir, tell me. He said, I'm the chairman of WLBT. What happened, after I left the government, the station persisted in its racist approach, and the FCC took away their license. And the black group, with the help of the United Church of Christ, applied for the license and got it. So justice somehow worked its own way. It took 35 years, but it happened.
There's a young woman, documentarian, Astra Taylor, and she's written an interesting book called A People's Platform, in which she argues, and I'm mentioning this because it's tied to your comment about the fairness doctrine's applicability when we were in a different media environment. She argues in this book that the media hierarchy has merely been transferred onto the web. What was originally a populist revolt of freedom of expression in the form of Wikipedia and YouTube and some of these forms of self-expression and creation that can exist without the corporate monolith supporting it. She argues that it doesn't really matter now because the people who were followed on Twitter and the people who gained notoriety on all these new media are still part of the traditional corporate media hierarchy. And therefore, the money that we talk about in our political theater just as much affects who has the megaphone in our discourse. I'm only mentioning this to you because I wonder, in this media environment, is it really that different?
The foundation of our country is in the First Amendment to the Constitution. We believe everybody can say what they think or believe what they think, and that's the most important value of our free society. And I think we have that today. I believe we have that.
In your very famous speech, you mentioned 6 principles. First, the people own the air, and that's the most important. Still, how can we ensure for our children and our children's children that the people will always own the air?
This is a conundrum today because of technology. When the regulation of communications began in this country, phone calls went by wire. Broadcasters performed through the air. Today, as Nicholas Negroponte of the MIT Media Lab observed, most people make their telephone calls today through the air and watch television through wire. It's a complete technological reversal. The foundation of the legal principles on which the government could regulate broadcasting was the use of the airwaves. If the airwaves become not used for mass communication, but only for telephone use, particularly for wireless use, and all people are getting their either access to the internet by wire or getting their television by wire, there's got to be a fundamental rethinking here. And I think we're just in the beginning of trying to adapt. The government wants new technologies to be innovative and to open the door to them and not stop them, and at the same time maintain principles of fairness and equality. So it's the same thing in our Constitution. We're always trying to find the right balance.
I love what you said in your 6th principle. I don't come to Washington to idly observe the squandering of the public's airwaves. You say you believe in the gravity of your mission, and you were very honest that even if others felt that you were taking the job too seriously, it was a commitment that was sacrosanct. And I think in retrospect, you're absolutely right. If the American population still needs to wake up to the reality that public broadcasting is in jeopardy, then what do you think will fundamentally change the big picture?
One thing is to keep telling people about Senator Goldwater and Joan CUNY.
Right.
I keep telling people the Republicans, conservatives, value public broadcasting.
And that's to reinforce that it is a nonpartisan medium.
That's my point.
Right.
And incidentally, when I was at the FCC, which is a bipartisan agency, we never once had a partisan vote. I would not allow it.
I wonder how you overcome that, because right now they're deeply divided along
Today it's a
partisan lines.
disaster because what's going wrong in our country is a fundamental, bitter, anti the other side, and we can't have that. I was a soldier in World War II. I'm part of the JFK generation. I wish we could somehow restore the values of that.
And to your children and grandchildren, what do you say?
My children and grandchildren are very much more sophisticated about modern communications than I am.
But I mean to instill the values from your service.
Well,
to our
they've done
country.
it. My kids have all done it. My three daughters are lawyers, doing good every day.
Well, they are remarkable. You are a remarkable American family between the FCC and Harvard Law School.
My wife and I say that the most important thing we've ever done is our kids.
Many important things. Newton Minow, thank you so much for joining me today.
Alexander, good luck with your program, and you're carrying on your grandfather's dreams.
Thank you, sir. And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other Open Mind interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation in memory of Richard Heffner, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Angelson Family Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, the Joan Gantz CUNY and Peter G. Peterson Fund, Carnegie Corporation of New York, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.